Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking to lawyer Ryan O'Connor about some of these untold success stories about vaccine mandate employment litigation. And Ryan, you had talked about sort of this long list of reasons why people might have refused or declined to get vaccinated. And I think that there maybe has been some public misunderstanding about why people refuse and perhaps what the implications of what a refusal are and what is actually legally required under human rights legislation in order to obtain one of these sort of exemptions or refusals?
Someone, for example, Christine, has a religious reason why they're not able to be vaccinated. For example, maybe they're staunchly pro-life and they object to the fact that vaccines are typically tested on fetal cell lines, don't contain aborted fetal cells, but are tested on fetal cell lines. If someone is doctrinally pro-life, they may object to vaccination on that
So
basis.
let me
There's a
just
misconception.
ask you there because I've heard this from a lot of people, and I know a lot of Catholics. Some Catholics have make that claim, and other Catholics don't. And I think that the Pope put out a statement about his view on the fetal cell lines. But what does the law say about that? Like, does the law get into parsing out theological beliefs, and what do you actually have to show to claim that?
I had this argument with one employer and one employer's lawyer about this very issue where I represented a Catholic individual who had a pro-life objection. They said, well, the Pope said get vaccinated. And I said, that's not what the Supreme Court says in terms of whether or not that's a valid religious reason for requesting an exemption. The Supreme Court has said in a seminal decision in 2004 that one needs to simply assert a sincere faith-based reason why they cannot comply, in this case with an employment policy, in order to validly request an exemption and to trigger the employer's duty to accommodate under the Human Rights Code. That means that the religious faith leader does not need to support the request. That the Pope, if you're Catholic, does not need to support the request, and in fact may interpret religious doctrine differently. Rather, it is a subjective analysis of the sincerity, and that it's faith-based and connected to the objection. And there's been a rampant misunderstanding in the public and the press, and frankly, even amongst lawyers, with all due respect, about when persons who have a religious exemption request ought to be accommodated.
Yeah, I think one of the things we need to think through is if you're asking a court to kind of cross examine a person on the basis of a spiritual belief, is that really the role that we want judges to be playing? Do we want um, courts to become arbiters of what is and is not a faith-based belief when they're debating the actual theology? I don't know that that's something that, I mean, the case law doesn't suggest that that's something we do. And from a public policy position, I don't know that it's something that we want our courts doing. What's your take?
Well, they shouldn't, and that's why the Supreme Court has set out a very simple test. The court is just to, or the Human Rights Tribunal is just, and the employer in these cases is just to explore the sincerity of the belief, not to challenge its validity. And if someone attends church regularly, leads a Christian lifestyle, and says, "Well, here's my Christian objection to vaccination," that's the end of the analysis. And unfortunately, many employers, in many cases that I've seen, they didn't even permit religious exemption requests, and that's completely wrong and a violation of the Human Rights Code. Now, that's some people said, I don't want to get vaccinated. That is a legitimate personal decision, and they ought to have been afforded the medical privacy and the respect to take that decision and to continue their employment or their education. But that's not something that's protected under the Human Rights Code. But also, someone saying I have a religious objection is protected, and some employers are simply saying, well, that's a personal belief. Well, how dare you say that about someone's faith, something they practiced for their entire life? And unfortunately, there was a lot of mixed messaging about that employers got wrong and ultimately led to unfair, unjust, and wrongful terminations.
Now, do you think that the public opinion on this topic has shifted? At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was just so much hostility to people who did not get vaccinated. Do you think that that has changed? And do you think that a shift might impact how the courts think about this issue?
I think so. I think courts are not insensitive to public opinion and the tenor of the time. That's why we saw so many COVID cases being dismissed on procedural grounds, mootness and otherwise, because I think courts were just loath to get involved in a very politically charged environment, which was the debate about COVID policy. But these cases that are moving forward, I certainly see employers becoming much more amenable to being open to resolution at an earlier stage. We're seeing employers, terminate people over mandates still, but ultimately pay them severance of doing the right thing. So I think that's largely been a response
Hmm.
to the public just having moved on from the
Hmm.
pandemic.
We've got to go to break now, but we will be right back.